G'day everyone, welcome back to another tips and tricks video. Now I'm building this record player cabinet here and I thought I'd take this opportunity to show you a few things that might help speed things up. Now if you want to see me build this cabinet, I'll link that below. And this is the video where I'll be going into a bit more detail about a few of the techniques that I've used to pull this off. So without further ado, we'll jump straight into the tips, and here's number one. This is a typical fence that you would install on your circular saw. That screws into the base plate and slides in left and right. And then this fence will follow the edge of your timber as you cut a certain distance in or out. That just slides in. There's a lock nut right here. We can lock that down once we're happy with the measurement between the fence and the blade. Now the only issue with a fence like this is if your timber is bent, the fence will follow that bend. Now most of the time that doesn't even matter if you're framing or decking or something. You can get that bend out later. You can manipulate the timber in many ways, but for furniture making, I won't be able to get any bends out from here on. So I won't be using a fence to cut these edges down. I'm going to be using a level. So using a straight edge as a fence, you need to get the measurement from the saw blade to the edge of the saw, which I know is 38 millimeters. So now what we want to do is mark our actual cut line, and from there we add the measurement we just took, which for me is 38. Make that mark at both ends, and then we can clamp our straight edge to those marks. Now make sure your clamps are out of the way of your straight edge. And now this edge of the saw is going to run along the straight edge and cut where we want it. This here is a way to clamp down the middle of the level without having to put a clamp on this side and block your path with the saw. I mean, you could do half and then move the clamp and do the next half, but we can get this in one nice pass because we've just got this piece of angle iron here. Now the pressure here is levering down on this straight edge, and that's going to stop the base plate from slipping underneath the level in the instance where the level isn't hard down to timber. So that's one way you can get out of that issue. While we're on the topic of using fences and circular saws, my next tip is in relation to one of these squares. Now this has got a bit of thickness to it, especially on this edge. So we can slide that hard up to our long edge and then use this to cut a square line without even marking it. Alright, now that we have a nice straight edge here, we can get a good square line across. Now this is going to be similar to the last method, except we're going to be cutting a bevel or a miter cut. Alright, because we don't have a table saw and we're in the garage and we're trying to keep things on a budget, we're going to be using a circular saw. Now that means we need to set up our own fences and take some measurements. This tip is similar to the last in the sense that we're using a fence or a square or a straight edge to cut a straight line, but we're also going to be cutting an angle at the same time. What we're going to do is make a test cut, and then using that test cut we can make some measurements, add those measurements to our final dimension or subtract them from our final dimension, set up our fence and make the cut, and we know that everything's going to be perfectly square, perfectly straight with the angle that we want on it. So to start with, we just want to make a square line. Now it's important that we have this square line here so that we can measure back to it later. And now we can make a test cut and take some measurements. Alright, so we just set our saw to 45 degrees. Now you'll notice, now that the saw is tipped over, the guard here is going to hit the straight edge before the fence hits the straight edge at the bottom. So I'm going to have to cut from the other way. So now the base plate is free to run along this straight edge. It's the same concept as before, we're just using a different edge of the base plate. Alright, now we can measure from the cut to the square line that we drew, and that is 118 millimeters in my case. It's always a good idea to write these numbers down. And with that measurement, we can either add it or subtract it to our piece of wood that we want to cut, and then set up our fence again. All right, now it's time for the real deal. Say we wanted to cut this piece at 750. We would mark 750, square it off, so that's now our cut line. So once we have our cut line, we can measure back 118 millimeters, which we found out earlier. Square that off, that's where we set our fence up. And now we're ready to cut along this fence. Now if this was a much longer piece of wood and you were cutting it in half, for example, in this case the little offcut just fell away and hit the ground. We don't care about that. But if you did care about both pieces, especially when it's a longer situation, you can support them from underneath with some old construction timber, like structural timber or something like that. And that way both pieces are supported when you're cutting them. Your blade won't jam up, which is one thing for safety, and it's going to make sure you get the cleanest cut on both pieces. Say you're ripping a board down like this, and you've got your cut in here. When you're turning this one piece of wood into two, sometimes the grain can be squishing these two parts back together. And when that gap squishes closed, it'll pinch the saw blade and the saw will want to kick backwards, which is just dangerous and it could ruin your cut. So to alleviate that, you can just slide a square or a wedge or a chisel in there, and that's going to stop these two bits from squishing back together, and that's going to stop your blade from jamming, and you'll be much better off. If you learned something and you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. It really goes a long way to helping me out. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. You'll see the future ones that come out, and you can check out the old ones that I've already done. If you have any questions or any tips or tricks of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments section below, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.